afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Utah Global Affairs Talk Series. And today we are honored to have Prof. Johans with us for the talk titled Malaysia's National Role Conceptions and Transitions of Foreign Policy from the Tunku to Mahathir. Right? We are also honored that we have a good number of participants to join this talk. And we have students and scholars, and also from Utah community, and also people from the business sector, right, to join us for this talk. So before we start the talk, let me briefly introduce Prof. Johans, your background. So Professor Johans Sarawana-Muthu is Professor Emeritus of University of Science Malaysia, USM, Adjunct Professor at Asia Europe Institute, University of Malaysia, and Adjunct Senior Fellow, RSIS, Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. So Prof. Johans has published extensively on Malaysia foreign policy, Malaysian middle class, general elections, new economic policy, and political Islam. And Prof. Johans is especially one of the leading experts in the study of Malaysia foreign policy, right? And his book, Malaysia Foreign Policy, the first 50 years, is somehow basically a must-read for us as a scholar who would like to study this Malaysia foreign policy. And Prof, I have finished reading your book, and these are the evidences. So before, in the coming 30 minutes, Prof. Johans is going to share with us his insights on Malaysia foreign policy based on this idea called national role conceptions. And during the talk, Prof. Johans is going to share with us the meaning of this concept. And after these 30 minutes of talks, then we will move into the Q&A sessions. And participants, please feel free during the talk and also during the Q&A sessions, please feel free to type in your questions at the box there, Q&A box you can see in front of the screen. And then I will, during the Q&A, I will read out the questions to Prof. Johans. Right. So without further ado, Professor Johans, the floor is yours.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for that very kind introduction, Dr. Ho, whom I happen to know before, but you know, I lost touch with him, and I'm aware of his work on Malaysia and Indonesia, you know, and a special relationship. Yes, it's indeed a great pleasure and a privilege to speak before you. And so thank you very much, the University of Tunku Abdul Rahman. I'm going to talk a little bit about Abdul Rahman afterwards, the Tunku, and also to Dr. Chin Ying Chan, who heads the Tan Cheng Lock Research Center, I believe, right? So thank you for all of you for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to share some new ideas I have about trying to understand Malaysia's foreign policy. So without further ado, I have 30 minutes. Let me just get into my PowerPoint. And hang on, I have to share the screen. These are new technologies that one has to learn, right? Yeah. There we go. So you see me at the side, and also Dr. Ho. So the talk is entitled Malaysia's National Role Conceptions and Transitions of Foreign Policy from the Tunku to Mahathir. I will deal mostly with the Tunku in the beginning and Mahathir at the end. There is not enough time to actually, in this paper that I've written, to deal with the other prime ministers. And let me begin by saying that this paper was actually a joint effort. The original paper was a joint effort by two co-researchers. And I should mention the name. I believe they might be listening to this, webinar. Eugene Mark and Nawaljit Singh, who are my colleagues at the Malaysia Studies program at the NTU, at the RSIS, Rajaratnam School of International Studies at NTU. Well, they were helping out with the research and helped to do an original version of the paper, but they shouldn't be held responsible for what I say here today, of course, right? So what I'm saying here is basically what I have sort of written most recently. Now, let me just go on to the next slide. So the presentation essentially is summarized in this overview. I will just sort of read to you the broad sort of outline, which is in the paper. It highlights the concept of national role conceptions, and I'll explain that in a minute, what it means. But during the Tunku period, which is of course from independence to 68, And then we fast forward into the second Mahathir, in the first and second Mahathir tenures of Mahathir 1.1, which is 81 to 2003, 2 Mahathir 2.0, which is 18 to 20. And I'm trying to basically understand the role conceptions which are used as a concept. A national role conception is a concept, I'll explain in a minute, which is used to define foreign policy, and also to not just define, but also to impact on foreign policy as well. They have changed over time. They're new role conceptions, they're old ones. Some of them remain consistent over time, but the nuances and the shifts within these role conceptions are well known. So Malaysia's foreign policy, as we know, articulated within the constraints of both the global, regional, as well as, and I think national role conceptions is very important here, a highly politicized, often divided domestic landscape. And this is one of the theses, or the main thesis of this presentation. It is the domestic landscape, or the domestic political game, which in a sense defines role conception. So in the Tunku era, we saw Malaysia essentially as a Western ally, symbolized by its pro-West, anti-communist role conceptions, national role conceptions. Since then, Malaysia has moved on with major power relationships across the globe, regional countries, and has shown a more stable, neutral, non-aligned stance. And in a way, it has emerged as what I would call a regional neutral strategist, another role conception, essentially emerging at the period of the premiership of Tun Razak. Okay, so after Tunku in 1969, it emerged. Then there have been national role conceptions under the very influential, tenures of Mahathir Mohamad. 22 years first, and then after that another 2 years. He likes the numbers 2, right? So 22 plus 2. Anyway, Malaysia emerged as a global champion of the South, an exemplar of looking east, the look east policy, a champion of moderate Islam, and various other sort of role conceptions. In the second period, I don't mention here, it was, a maritime nation and so on. But all of this, I would argue, of course, are premised on prime ministers and their predilections, no doubt. But yet, one can argue that it is very much embedded into a domestic political game. And that's the main thesis of this presentation. So domestic contestations over NCR and RCs had begun even in the Tunku period. I don't really have too much time to get into that, but if we do Q&A, we can raise questions. And they have often caused the redefinition or the reconstituting of role conceptions, as well as, in some instances, and I have a very important example at the end to show you, the abandonment of policy directions. So you see, the domestic political game or the domestic factor in foreign policy is very important. Okay, so I move on to the next slide, which is essentially to talk about the concept itself. Again, this is a very interesting concept, and I'll let you know a secret. The concept is of course a concept by Carl Holste, Calavi Jaco Holste, who was the professor at University of British Columbia, where I did my PhD. He was my supervisor. So he supervised my thesis on Malaysian foreign policy. And Holste wrote about this in 1970, as early as that. But some other people have also used the concept as well. So role conceptions can be taken to be the dependent variable side of foreign policy, meaning how do you define foreign policy? And this was a problem which Holste was very concerned about, because he said the study of foreign policy we didn't seem to know what we were studying. So we need to define it well. So role conceptions are a way of defining or giving an idea of what foreign policy is all about. But they also are important for the independent or input side. They can affect the national leanings of a country and it driving certain policies and so on, right? So all this is in his article, very long article. And I would just simply use his definition here. And I think that's the definition I and my colleagues will be using. He defines national role conceptions as the policymakers' definitions of the general kinds of decisions, commitments, rules, and actions suitable to their state in the international or regional systems, all right? All right, let's go on to the next one. I've added a little bit of theorizing into whole state by taking my own sort of notion of foreign policy, which is from my book, Malaysia's Foreign Policy, the First 50 Years, which Ying Chan has very kindly read right from the beginning to the end. So this schema tells you where role conceptions or national role conceptions are situated. So I've added the notion of the domestic political game, which you do not find in my book, right? But it is on the input side of the equation. Role conceptions can be seen to be affected by both the input side and as well as defining the output side, which are the state's identity, its interests, its policies, and so on. So on the input side, of course, we have the domestic political environment, we have state-society relations, we have state transnational or global relations, and those are the things that tend to define what the state is able to exercise in its foreign policy, the agential power of the state. So that's how I would locate it theoretically in the literature. In terms of studies of national role conceptions, there have been very few and far in between, but and particularly for Malaysia, only one. One study by David Han, who is actually, oddly enough, he's also from RSIS, Malaysia Studies Program, and his study focused on Malaysia-Singapore relations, is quoted down, cited down below. And it looks at the role conception of Malaysia vis-a-vis Singapore. So he says that the basic underlying role conception of a Malaysia-Singapore relations is a senior-junior one, where Malaysia is a senior, right? Malaysia is the one that gave birth to Singapore, quote unquote. Maybe some of my friends out there may not like it, but true, Singapore is part of Malaysia. So that role conception continued for a long time. However, there were reenactments of that role conception. See, the nuances would shift depending on who is the prime minister or who are the prime ministers on either side. So Abdullah Badawi and Razak, importantly, sort of what he calls inserted the notion of important symbolic partner and historical significant other. Very interesting psychological concepts with respect to Malaysia. Go and read the article if you want to understand more deeply what David Han is talking about. So that's the sort of research one can do, see, when you have the notion of role conception. In terms of broader studies outside of Malaysia, we have the one that I've cited here on Turkey, which is interesting. Turkey, of course, is a very strong regional power. So one of its role conceptions is natural leader of particular Muslim countries, regional power, big brother, etc., protector of Muslim minorities. And that's the article by Gersel, cited there. And another interesting, there are a few others, but I'm just taking these two as examples. Another interesting one is by Mok Faisal Karim, who actually compares South Korea and Indonesia as middle powers. And one can go and read about that. But I have myself also used the concept of middle power for Malaysia. I've used the term middle powership or middle power manship. If you drop the man now because it's more politically correct to say middle powership. It's essentially using the statecraft of this middle level of powers to deal in a way with the asymmetry of power that exists in the world today, with the major powers dominating sort of politics, international politics. So middle power conception is also a possible role conception that one can use for a country like Malaysia. Now, let me quickly get into the meat of the paper, which is actually to look at the Tunku period and the two Mahathir periods. So under Tunku, basically you had Malaysia, as I already mentioned, as a pro-Western, anti-communist, foreign policy. Many people have written about this, including myself. But there was essentially there was a change at the end of the Tunku period. Now, the Tunku period was not entirely uncontested. I haven't mentioned in this PowerPoint, but let's take the one example where he was so pro-Western that he wanted to join the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, right? So 1954. That there was a huge protest from the UMNO youth. They did not want to see Malaysia so embedded in the Western, worldview. So they objected to it, and Tunku himself has admitted, I think it's in my book, that I couldn't join CITO. They don't seem to like it, so I didn't join CITO. So there are foreign policy role conceptions or foreign policy orientations or actions that can be contested and often are not implemented. The Ismail Peace Plan came soon after Tunku. So Dr. Ismail is an important person in reconceptualizing Malaysia as a regional and neutral player. He was the one that proposed ZOPFAN, Zone of Peace and Freedom in Southeast Asia, under Razak. So I would argue that again, this is again the domestic political game. Sorry, I had to drink some water. Where a counter elite already existed, and within that counter elite was also Mahathir Mohamad. If you follow history, and this counter elite was not entirely happy with the kind of national role conceptions or foreign policy, basically, that Tunku had, and they refurbished or reconstituted foreign policy differently, and this agential power, you might say, of the political elite. Was also constrained by domestic forces. In the post-May 69 situation, the racial riots, the rise of Bumiputra politics, very important, that reconstituted in a great way both domestic and foreign policy. In a way, also the kind of political culture that existed or that prevailed also changed. Now, this notion of the domestic political game has been written up by two theorists, which I cite here, Juliet Carbo, and I'm using the paper, of course, in the academic paper that we're writing. We have these two persons cited. How am I doing for time? Okay. I'm still okay, right? Because now we'll move into the Mahathir period. Mahathir, what can you say? The man is still around. He's been one of the most important, now they say influencer in social media. But he was not just in social media, he was very active, as I said, even in the post-Tunku Period era. And of course, he emerged as a prime minister in 1981, a long story there. And in terms of foreign policy, I think many people have written about Mahathir. In particular, I call him an iconoclast. I mean, it's a person that really breaks all the images and past rules and conventions. But essentially, I would say that his foreign policy, I mean, to cut a long story short, the first Mahathir 1.0 was embedded in this discourse or narrative of anti-West. So in contrast with the Tunku's pro-West, right? Complete contrast. And embedded in a South-South cooperation kind of notion. And it also included the idea of being a regional strategist. Mahathir proposed this East Asian Economic Caucus, remember? Some of these policies have become part and parcel or dovetail into ASEAN policies. He was an exemplar looking east. When everybody was looking west, he was looking towards Japan, Korea, etc. For economic development. So he was a developmentalist. And of course, a champion of moderate Islam, a very good book by Shanti Nair on Malaysia's foreign policy and Islam. I will be citing it shortly. Talks about how Mahathir brought Islam to foreign policy. So the Muslim world NRC, National Role Conception, was the handle for Mahathir for his very strong anti-Zionist stances against Israel, chastising the Western world for its double standards. You know that story, right? It's plenty, one can write endlessly about those things. And Mahathir, interestingly, also used the narrative of Asian values. He was one of them. Along with, there was a Japanese thinker as well. But again, you know, Mahathir was there in the forefront of this counter-hegemonic trope to reject both Westernism and to legitimize, to delegitimize American Western models of practices. I want to read to you something which is written by Helen Nasadure, sorry, not Helena, who is a, excuse me, who's a lecturer in, I think in Monash. Anyway, she wrote about this aspect of Mahathir's foreign policy. So I would say, let me read. The primacy of economics in Mahathir's foreign policy also served a domestic purpose. And that's one of the points I'm making. When he used the Asian values narrative as a counter-hegemonic trope to reject both Westernism in the larger sense and neoliberalism in the global order, so as to ideologically delegitimize American and Western models and practices of human rights and liberal democracy, right? While also helping to legitimize the interventionist approach to economic development based on communitarian end goals rather than the maximization of individual self-interest. Very interesting. I mean, you want to go deeper into this national concept. So this was Mahathir 1.0, essentially. Many more things one can say, but for now, I think we can let this rest and go on to the fast forward, right? In between, you have, I mean, a long paper would deal with the period of Abdullah Badawi and also Najib, see? But for now, let's move on to the next one, which is the second tenure. It's very short, but even in that short period, we have seen some very interesting ideas or in terms of national role conceptions. Mahathir maintained his earlier NRCs, right? You know, there's no much change, the anti-Western rhetoric, all that stuff is there, the anti-Zionist. But there was a new national role conception which seemed to have come out, and that was that of a maritime nation. This sort of maritime nation idea also was what do you call it? Was highlighted in the defense white paper, which was published in 2019. Now, you may not say everything came from Mahathir, but it was a national role conception that arose during the 2.0 period. But the Look East policy was again, emphasized by Mahathir with his visit to Japan, even the talk of another national car, etc., maybe with Japanese cooperation. But the Look East policy, I argue in the paper, is now inflected by yet another kind of looking east because of the rise of China. So you see how the nuances can shift, right? The rise of China. And Mahathir was grappling with this in the what do you call it, on the election campaign of 2018, right? He took on China actually, and he took on, he was very critical of China's penetration, its economic development, etc., the Forest City project, etc. But when he became Prime Minister, there was a change. I mean, there's a few people who have written about this, and I have as well. And it was over basically around the renegotiation of the investment projects, the big one being the ECRL. Now, he managed to shave through negotiation using Daim as his man to shave off 21 billion from the cost of the ECRL. Some people like Jomo are saying that maybe that's not enough, they should shave off much more, but never mind. But so the looking east included now this China thing. And I think overall he's accepted the BRI idea. And I think he would see China as a counterpoint, as a counter, hegemonic kind of player, global player vis-a-vis the West in China. So you see it's part of that game as well. And of course, it plays into the domestic political game as well. China is still very important for the Malaysian community, particularly maybe the Chinese community. He wants to also win votes in that quarter. Mahathir with 2.0 witnessed new approaches in tweaks to role conceptions. championing moderate Muslim causes. The KL summit was held very recently by him, taking on Saudi Arabia. Its role as a regional neutral strategist in a more multipolar world now, where hedge diplomacy, which in a way Mahathir was sort of practicing, but nobody called it hedge diplomacy then, right? Middle powership, I call it, right? But now the term hedge diplomacy is the one in vogue, hedging. My good friend, Dr. Quick, is the one that has given it a lot of writing a lot about it. So hedge diplomacy, hedging has become a new thing and very strongly practiced these days by middle powers and small countries. So that all existed. However, there was yet another interesting shift. All this is because of Pakatan Harapan and so-called progressive politics. The shift to stronger human rights stances. However, and there's where the rub it was, in terms of foreign policy contestation, there was an intense domestic contestation and protest over Malaysia's wanting to sign on the human rights conventions. In particular, Malaysia's, the foreign minister, Saifuddin Abdullah, has said, we will sign on the international convention on the elimination of racial discrimination, right? The UN one, and also the Rome Statute. So these are human rights policies which were not there in the past, but had emerged in the Mahathir 2.0 period. And there was also the continuation of what Shanti Nayak calls co-religionist Islamic courses that continue. And I said the KL summit was an example. This, of course, dovetailed very nicely into the domestic political game. I will return to the human rights thing later and talk about policy disruption. But for now, this was smooth. Malaysia's use of Islam, as mentioned as analyzed by Shanti Nayak, constituted what was called right Islam, moderate, as opposed to wrong extreme Islam, which was attributed to the government's, those days, past was the opponent, and also the international extremists. So Mahathir's persistent and aggressive pro-Palestinian, anti-Zionist, and RCs and novel attempts to elevate the KL summit, global Muslim soft power, I think, continued and set very well, of course, with the domestic political game, a predominantly Muslim constituency of Malaysia. Okay, so that's the argument I'm making. However, this did not sit well. This was the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, the Rome Statute, which is the human rights statute. A very strong constituency protested against it, essentially, as you can see here. You all remember the event, right? 55, they wanted to have 500,000 people actually, but in the end, only 55,000 people protested. They were all mainly Muslim Malays in the heart of Kuala Lumpur, 8th December 2020. 2020, is it? No. 20 December is now. Sorry, there's a mistake here, right? 2018, I think. Sanctioned by PAS and Islam. Called for pledges to uphold the sanctity of Islam and in rejecting the ICERT. So ICERT was in fact, 2018, huh? It was already rescinded earlier in November 2018. And the Rome Statute signing scuttled even later, in April 2019. So you see the strength of this domestic factor in foreign policy conceptions or national role conceptions. So the idea that Malaysia should be a champion of human rights, a bit susah, I think, as of now, because of this very strong constituency of wanting not to shape the domestic or to to affect the domestic political order, right? I think that might be about the end of what I want to present, but I think in terms of timing also it's not bad. Just about right, in fact, if I can just read to you the broad conclusions of the paper. So I would say that we are in a period, in fact, in the paper that I read, we start off by talking about the unprecedented political conditions Malaysia is in. And that example of the disruption of foreign policy is actually a very, very interesting, what do you call it, interesting sort of symbolism, or is symbolic of that period of policy fluidity and disruption, right? So we're in a political landscape now which is highly fractured because of the political fragmentation that has occurred, particularly within the Malay community or the Malay political order or the Malay political class. So where internal contestations can disrupt any new foreign policy, as it has done in the bucket, have you noticed? And maybe the political players are playing particularly into the political game because of this current political situation. That said, I don't think foreign policy is very much in the minds of the political actors right now. Okay, so I would say that while policy contestations can and will disrupt new foreign policy directions, and it did in the instance of the ICER and Rome Statute, it doesn't often happen, and now foreign policy is probably not very much in the forefront. There are issues to do with the South China Sea. It has come up here and there, but nothing much has really changed. Hishamuddin was taken on by not criticizing enough China by the former Foreign Minister Anifah, Aman, but nothing. It just no ripple effect whatsoever. It just continued. The fundamentals of Malaysian foreign policy, in a sense, have remained fairly stable. National role conceptions have been there, continue to be fairly stable, but the nuances, the changes, the shifts, of course, can happen in the future under this, I would say, present, right? Under the new Prime Minister, there's a new Prime Minister, the 8th Prime Minister of Malaysia, Mr. Muhyiddin Yassin, Tan Sri actually, Muhyiddin Yassin. So let me just read the conclusion of my paper here. I would say that first, Malaysia would likely continue to practice non-alignment and be friendly to all countries, with the exception of Israel, which always remains outside. These fundamentals are unlikely to change in the near future. Second, the Islamic agenda of Malaysia's foreign policy has always been present and will not go away, regardless of the changes in domestic politics. And thus is Muslim world orientation, that champion of Muslim causes will remain in place. Third, and the South China Sea will emerge and continue to be a security focus, particularly now when Malaysia sees itself as a maritime nation, and it's got a lot of economic interests in the South China Sea. Fourth, Malaysia will continue to maintain its hedge diplomacy and its middle powership vis-a-vis US, China, Japan, Australia, and all these other powers, including South Korea, India. Within the Asia-Pacific, now under Trump was called the Indo-Pacific region, the larger Asia-Pacific region. Fifth, Malaysia, under any new government, I would argue, would continue to further economic diplomacy under ASEAN and be a regional strategist. Despite the fundamentals remaining in Malaysian foreign policy, I would say, however, the current preoccupation and in fact the crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic would mean that foreign policy may take a backseat for a while. Shall I just end there then and leave it, pass it on to Dr. Ho. Right, thank you. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Prof, for very interesting insights and sharing. So participants, please feel free to ask your questions. You can type in questions at the chatting box or at the Q&A, and I will read out to Prof. So while waiting for your questions, my questions to Prof is that we have been learning that some people argue that after Mahathir Prime Ministership, right, especially after Mahathir Prime Ministership 1.0,
right.
We can argue that basically Malaysia no longer has foreign policy or have clear foreign policy, right? So to what extent this NRCs, these concepts in Malaysia foreign policy is conditioned by this Mahathir factor, and are we, because of the continuous changing political landscape in Malaysia, are we on its ways moving towards a new kind of NRCs, and what will be the possible new kind of NRC for Malaysia? Thank you.
Okay. Shall I just go ahead and take on that question, Dr. Ho? Yeah, you know, as I said, I concluded by saying there's not likely to be much more in terms of thinking, right, about NRC, but if we're looking forward to an era, a new era, post-Mahathir, let's call it. I mean, we've been talking about post-Mahathir for a long time, but this time it could be a real post-Mahathir era. Yes, there could be some major changes, but as I said, some of the national role conceptions will be very stable, right? How could we escape from, you know, the idea that, let's start with the one that Tunku, where the change came after the Tunku, where we are a non-aligned nation, right? We are a role conception where we are, we do not see ourselves as either supporting the West or supporting, I don't know what is it called now, the East, is it called the East? So we play the middle road, and in a way it's also a middle in terms of foreign policy strategies, middle power statecraft. So that one remains very much the same, and that is locked into the ASEAN. You know, ASEAN has been very important, I think, right? So the ASEAN configuration or entity has been an anchor for Malaysia's foreign policy. And in a way, Malaysia was also part of creating that anchoring in ASEAN, right? The whole ZOP fund, the whole neutrality, the push for, because ASEAN was very split, you know, but now ASEAN has become, because it was it was communist and non-communist. So now ASEAN has become more of a, Indonesia is very important. I think more of a non-aligned kind of a bloc. At the same time, in terms of trade, economic perspective, it also champions, if not third world causes, at least the cause of the developing countries of the world. So it takes that line. I think that will not change very much. Muslim, the basic underlying, you see, my argument is always that, I for one, I take the position that Malaysia is a multicultural country. I think it'd be interesting in the future. We should have a multicultural national role conception, not just a Muslim moderate country. See, you want to push me now. I'm prepared to say that we can move in that direction, right? But we would need a leader with that kind of orientation. Could it be Anwar Ibrahim? No, don't know, right? Or post Anwar Ibrahim, really multicultural figure. Then we do not need to have, we need not have to have a policy which is just called moderate Muslim orientation. We are a multicultural society after all. So that's an interesting possible development, but I do not see it happening, right? I do not see it happening in the near future, okay? Which other one is there? The human rights one is actually important too, because if you're a progressive country, right, you're progressive, you should be accepting all of these conventions, right? What is wrong in saying that we are against all forms of racial discrimination in the world? My God, I mean, that's standard universal human practice. I'm sorry, I'm putting it publicly now. Why did we reject it? It was a very correct foreign policy to adopt. However, because of the major protests that we had, the contestation, we had to abandon that policy. So in the future, again, it'd be interesting to see that kind of development. It would have to be a person or a prime minister or foreign minister, I think it would be prime minister rather than foreign minister, who would have those predilections and is prepared to push along those lines. Otherwise, I would see things as I analyze and read out in my conclusion to be basically that kind of trajectory for Malaysia. Yeah.
Thank you, Prof. Thanks for the very thoughtful answer for my questions. And more questions are coming in. Okay. So one of the questions coming from Ezati Jaki. He say, Prof. Johan, thank you for your sharing. My question is, how do you see the difference in NRC's impacted the Rakyat's notions of national identity? We are seeing the rise of people power globally today. Are you seeing the relationship between this NRC and the people power, or what we call citizenry? That's the question.
It's a very interesting question. Zaki, right? Thanks very much for that question. And yes, the thing with foreign policy, and all of us who study international relations and foreign policy will say that foreign policy has often not been a major concern of civil society. But then I don't think that necessarily is a correct interpretation, right? And the realist paradigm of international relations would say, realism doesn't deal with idealism. So this notion of people power, people having a say, that foreign policy must always be cognizant of people's interests, etc., is often not considered to be an important factor in foreign policy. But I do agree with you. Let me sort of read your question again. The difference between NRC implementing Rakyat's notion of national identity and the question of national identity as well, and the relationship. Yeah, I would say that in a way the concept is very, very good for that. You see, so while I argued in my presentation that the national role conceptions are always linked to the domestic factor, the domestic political game, it can also be seen not just negatively. The way I presented it, maybe one may have thought that, the domestic political game is usually very disruptive. It's the one that, that would, change the national role conceptions according to some very partisan, parochial interest. Why not? Why isn't it possible that an opposite sort of, effect happens? That is to say, national role conceptions are very much tied to people, and a more people-centric foreign policy could emerge if national role conceptions are locked into people's needs and people's the rakyat citizenry, aspirations. So again, it's actually answering the same question that Dr. Ho raised. This possibility will only arise if we have a more progressive, post-Mahathir factor, you might call it, in foreign policy. I would look forward to something like that. But I think the framework of analysis that I've used, I think allows for that to occur.
Right. Thanks, Prof. Another questions coming from Dr. Chin Iman, chairperson of TCLC Center, and it's about the recent APEC summit. So in this APEC Leaders Summit, what is the message is the Malaysian government trying to portray to the world through this summit?
Interesting. I'm not very, to confess, I mean, it was on a Zoom, it was not a full, right? It was held with as an online kind of summit. It did convey, I think, the idea that there still is the idea of having Asia-Pacific as an entity, because APEC is very important, right? And for me, I think Mahathir wanted to stay on and continue with APEC. It is also a kind of a messaging, broadly, I would say, that the Asia-Pacific remains as a very important entity vis-a-vis the Trump idea of the Indo-Pacific. So that there, if you look at the politics of the Indo-Pacific, there was I think again, I am just guessing, all right? I'm speculating because it's not clear. The Indo-Pacific, that one's clear, was an attempt, a strategic attempt by the Trump administration to shift the focus away from China, right? Everybody knows that. So Indo-Pacific. The Asia-Pacific had a participation of China, of course, and APEC has a participation of China. So I think the messaging could be that we, and ASEAN has taken a very strong, the messaging could be that we cannot leave out the major forces and the major players of the Asia-Pacific. And APEC is the organization or the international entity where the Asia-Pacific, powers or Asia-Pacific countries are actively involved in. And then you have RCEP, which is the very important, trade agreement that was just signed by the Asia-Pacific countries. India is out of it. India is still not interested to sign it. But a kind of messaging could be that Asia-Pacific, which includes China, remains very important for the countries of the region. Quick answer, no real, just speculation.
So, Prof. Johan, you just now mentioned about this Malaysia, one of the continuity within Malaysia foreign policy is to have this engage in middle powermanship.
Right.
Right. Some might argue that middle power is like country like those advanced middle-sized country like Australia, South Korea. Do you think it's realistic for Malaysia to engage in this middle powermanship? Is it fundamentally beneficial to our national interest?
Good point, good point. So, like I mentioned, the National Road Conception of, there was paper that was written by, I think his name is Faisal Karim. And he, of course, looks at Indonesia and South Korea, which I think hardly anybody would argue, right, in that case, that both these countries are sufficiently, have a sufficiently strong stature and presence, so on, in terms of size too, in terms of the population in Indonesia is massive, right? So, okay, from that point of view, one can use the physical or the quantitative elements of middle powership to say that certain countries don't qualify. But you'll be surprised, Dr. Ho, that people like Jonathan Ping, besides myself, there was also Nosal and Stubbs, who have written about middle power, Malaysia as a middle power, using middle power statecraft. So it does not mean that if you're large enough or that you have the military wherewithal or the military hardware, then you can consider yourself to be in middle power. Take, for example, Sweden. Sweden is a pretty small country, but it has wielded, is punched above its weight, let's put it that way, right? It's wielded a lot of political agency in terms of international relations, which is way above its, you might say, physical endowments as well as its, its size and everything. So Malaysia has that possibility. Having said that, and there have been analysis, that have been done, there is also the concept of small states. And I think people have also used the notion of small states. Which one is more appropriate? I think depending on which context you're talking about. Of course, if you're dealing with a very large country, a very powerful country, you can say, I'm a small state. But if you're dealing with another set of states, you might say within, another context, ASEAN or whatever, you might say you have that kind of ability to be a middle power. But again, within the region, I would say, right? I mean, it's quite logical to say that. You're a student of India, you're studying Indonesia, you would have a lot of problems trying to profile yourself as a middle power, particularly with Indonesia as the largest country in Southeast Asia. And there will be, you remember there was a time when Mahathir, again, Mahathir's policies are very middle power-like, right? So when Mahathir was, proposing this and proposing that, I think it was Suharto who called him a little Sukarno. So you have that reaction. So there are all these ramifications, or these what do you call it?
Learning from Sukarno, President.
Yeah. So this, you might try to. So you can best say maybe you're an aspirant middle power. And to be fair, we are the academic. We are the ones that are saying Malaysia middle power. None of the foreign policy policymakers, including the prime minister, ever argue. Mahathir has gone out. I'm a very small state. I'm a small state. He's been very modest, but his modesty is in his words, not in his actions. All right.
Right. So another interesting questions coming from Ms. Tang Wee. The recent presidential elections. Do you foresee any changes in Malaysian foreign policy in response to these inaugurations of Joe Biden as the new U.S. president, new U.S. president?
Interesting one, yeah. Yeah, I suppose one could say that there have been a lot of concern, not just Malaysia, but overall, I think the group as a whole, the ASEAN countries have been concerned about I mentioned the Indo-Pacific strategy. So the ASEAN countries had what they call the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific policy. And they took a hedging kind of position. That is that they did not see they saw the importance of maintaining the, I think they did see it, to put it plainly, they would have seen it as an attempt to downsize China, to sort of basically take China out of the equation in terms of foreign relations and major power relationships, and therefore de-emphasize China's role. But the ASEAN countries now, and Malaysia included, would probably be able to go back to the older kind of relationship, or be more comfortable, let's say, to have that kind of relationship with East Asian countries. In particular, I suppose the question will be China. But it also depends very much on Biden's China policy. So the Trump policy has been super, aggressive against China, and been taking on China on every score, including the trade war. If that trade war has, is less obvious, or has become less of a problem within the Biden administration, then a more normal relationship would take place. That's with respect to China. And in fact, directly, actually, even the question should be posed in terms of the US relations with the region. I mean, Trump had hardly any interest, right, in the Southeast Asian region. For him, it was like the backwater somewhere and not so important. So, as opposed to the pivot of Obama and Hillary Clinton. So if you have a Democratic president, Kamala Harris, who has Asian roots, we might see a return to another pivot back to Asia, and that would be fantastic for the countries of the region. And Malaysia should definitely play up to this development. In fact, it should be encouraging the US to become more engaged and more participant within the economic as well as the political context of Asia. And I think in the light of also the South China Sea problems, China has been quite aggressive in terms of its policy vis-a-vis Malaysia. Well, not so much aggressive, but it's all these intrusions, right? 89 intrusions from. So it's good to have that balance and to have the US kind of policy re-engaging with Malaysia and the ASEAN countries. Yeah.
I think coming new administration will be more engaged with these regions, hopefully, when compared to the current Trump administrations. I think now we can have our last questions by Dr. Rajini, and I would like to also relate these questions to the main title of our talk today. So he asks, leadership sustainability affects the NRC and foreign policy, and how do you see this in the era of Dr. Mahathir? So I would like to combine it with more my additional content to these questions.
Yeah, okay.
So we are looking at the Tunku and the Mahathir. So what are the, in terms of NRC, what are the lasting legacy of these two prime ministers that you still can see the lasting effects in today Malaysia foreign policy? Both our first prime minister, Tunku Abdul Rahman, and our fourth and the previous prime minister, Dr. Mahathir.
All right. Again, to Dr. Rajni Kumar's point about leadership sustainability, I think that's very well taken. It is leadership that, after all, is behind national role conceptions. But I also emphasize both the positive and the negative aspects, that national role conceptions are also linked to our domestic environment, right? They have to be part and parcel embedded in it. That's important. But it's the leader that actually valorizes, makes sense of national environment. So, and that leads us, of course, leadership sustainability, strong leadership, forward-looking, progressive leadership. If I can throw in two other words, very important for good national role conceptions. And that leads me to the question, Dr. Ho, about the legacy of Tunku. And I would say both have important legacies. I mean, it's not that the Tunku is, I think let me very quickly hasten to say that I'm not dismissing the Tunku, even though, let's start with the Tunku, that his legacy in a way had been changed considerably. He was pro-Western, in his orientation, etc., very strongly anti-communist, but he was a product of the time. And Malaysia's foreign policy was embedded in a particular context in that particular time. So that's why those national role conceptions were, in a way, in sync. The leader saw that it was in sync with the developmental goals, you might say, and the overall kind of needs. National needs is a concept I've used in my analysis of foreign policy. Within the national needs of Malaysia, it was important to have those role conceptions. So role conceptions are the way in which you deal with the external environment and how you then use the external environment for your domestic gains and your domestic purpose, quote unquote, your national interest, right? So the Tunku's legacy, I think, was an important one, in that he showed that Malaysia, as an independent small state, at that point in time, was no doubt about it, right? Without any kind of military capability or anything, right? That you could actually survive and do very well, in an international environment as a small state, independent state, newly independent. In fact, I would celebrate Tunku's anti-apartheid policies. I forgot to say, he was one of the champions against racial discrimination internationally. And he took on South Africa. And because of that, South Africa eventually was ejected from the Commonwealth, right? So here's the Tunku's very important legacy. Tunku was a good man. So, and he contributed that way. Mahathir was a novel thinker, iconoclast. So he is, for me, his most important contribution, broadly speaking, was his counter-hegemonic foreign policy. Again, a different context of international relations as emerged, right? And you have now maybe a small power, experimental power, dealing with major powers. You have to work. Malaysia is trying to become a newly industrializing country, maybe even a developed country by 2020. It has not happened, but that was the aspiration. So how do you then have, what sort of role conception should one have to deal with that? And Mahathir came up with some very good ones, to deal with it and to push Malaysia forward looking is, maybe you might not agree 100% with it. The developmental state, that was his role conception. And that is his legacy. And he has put Malaysia on the map in terms of its counter-hegemonic stances, very, very, principled stance against some of the atrocities committed by Zionists on the Israeli state against the against the Palestinians on the map. Malaysia is there. It's the overall policy of calling out the West double standards in policies, right? He stood up and said those things that a lot of third world leaders would not say. So here you are. I think so. Mahathir's legacy is definitely not something to be belittled. He certainly did contribute a great deal in terms of putting Malaysia on the map and also championing some very important causes of the South and the third world. I think that could be it. So now we need to go. Wait. One more fine point. We need to move beyond the Mahathir kind of national role concept, which is what I was talking about. Malaysia now wants to think of itself as a more progressive. We are in another era, progressive, multiracial society, multiracial country. Now we have to move. How do we move in that direction? And how is foreign policy able to then help us move in that direction? And what sort of national role conceptions would be the appropriate ones for a new leader of Malaysia?
Yeah, as Prof. Johan said, the foreign policy of Malaysia is very much linked to the changing political landscape in our domestic politics. But through your sharing, I can observe that both Tunku and Mahathir is more like a kind of principle-oriented foreign policy. And the continuity in our foreign policy of Malaysia is to be more non-aligned and be friendly to everyone, be friends to everyone. That is what I've learned from your talk. So basically, that basically will be the end of our talk today. So on behalf of CCCB, we have 3 centers co-organizing the talk: CCCB, TCLC, and CIS. We would like to thank Prof. Johan for being very so patient and sharing as much as you can with us your very important, original, and these valuable insights. And for the participants, thank you for being able to participate in this talk. And I would like to inform you also, actually, Prof. Johan has also given a similar talk, similar content of this, similar title of this talk at this Asia Euro Institute. So if after this talk, if you want to have a deeper understanding of the content of Prof. Johan talk, you can go to Asia Euro Institute website to have access to the video recording of a similar kind of talk given by Prof. Johan, right? So we hope to see everyone again. It's an honor that so many people come and join our talk, and we wish in future, Prof. Johan, you again is willing to accept our invitations, again be our speaker in future in our talk series. So that will be the end of this talk. And thank you, everyone. Thank you so much, Prof. Johan, and hope to see you soon, and hope to see everyone soon. Okay, thank you.